Okay, so this is the first talk I'm doing like professionally ever. So I'm incredibly nervous, especially because my slides are mostly just the notes that I've made for myself. So I'm going to pretend that I'm in a debate. So if I sound aggressive, it's mostly because that's how I'm going to feel comfortable while I speak. I'm Dee. I've been working at Free Lives for about a year now. And what really pushed me into writing about this talk is that for the last year, I've been fairly involved with the game jams that Free Lives usually has. I help run them, mostly making sure like everyone eats and has a place to sit and like has power cables. And so I've had a lot of experience just watching the game jams and sort of experiencing them and seeing things that I think could be super beneficial to the industry and just paying attention to the industry as I've seen it and the changes I think need to be made. So I've labeled my talk The Missing Middle, as you can see, Transformation in South Africa, because I think that while we have a good industry that's geared towards transformation and understands the importance of it, I think that there's a step that we miss when we think about transformation, right? So I want to look at the context particularly in the sense that the gaming industry isn't as transformed as it could be, I think, right? I think that it's still fairly new, it's quite small. I mean, the numbers I got is that the South African gaming industry is like 276 people in the whole country, which is incredibly, incredibly minute. But I think that while it's this small, this is a great time for us to be actively pursuing transformation ideals. I think that there are some good things happening at the moment. I'm going to give a shout out to Regina because she does 67 games. She's involved with Serious About Gaming. I'm also going to give a shout out to Aisa because they understand the need to transform the industry. And the way that the transformation works at the moment is very much focused on the underprivileged communities. It's focused on giving people who don't have access to the tools or the abilities or the money to study those kinds of resources, which I think is massively important. I think that for the long term, that's the way that we sustain and grow the industry. But while I do think that that's important, there's a second step that I don't think we often talk about, which is the blind spot, the missing middle, whereby we ask ourselves the question, why is it that the people who do have the opportunities or the access to the studying or the tools they need to make games aren't getting more involved in the industry? And what can we do as a community to make it better, right? So as you can see, this is predominantly talking about like middle class, marginalized people. I'm predominantly talking about like people with access, but like there are certain things that I think that are quite important that we can be doing to make it a lot better. Okay. So one of the few things I've noticed, right, is that the industry itself tends to be a little bit insular and not as inclusive as it can be. I don't think that this is necessarily a conscious decision. I don't think it's because of any bad blood or like terrible people. I think that game design attracts sort of awkward and slightly weird and very shy or socially awkward people, which makes it very difficult as a new person to come into that. One of the things I've noticed at game jams particularly is that when they happen, everyone groups with the people they know. They group with the people they've worked with before. So if you're a new person coming into that, it can be quite hard because either you're left on your own, you're feeling really awkward, it's hard to, you know, find your group of people unless they're ready-made to start making games with. And I think that that can be fairly exclusionary, but I'll get into game jams in a bit. That's where my talk goes next. I also think that one of the biggest things that hamper transformation, particularly with the middle class or the people who are playing a lot of games, is that they just don't know that it's a thing, right? I think that we need to be making more of a conscious effort to be reaching out to communities in terms of schools. I think we need to be doing things like getting into like building better relationships with universities. I think we need to be making an active effort to simply make people aware of the fact that not only is the industry something that exists, but it is entirely possible to make a living off making games. I think that's really important. I also think that like because of the nature of the event and the nature of the kind of people involved with them, it may be exclusionary in the sense of the small things that we don't think about when we create these kinds of events, right? So it's thinking about, can people get to the event? If it ends late, can people get home? Like, will people be able to afford to like be able to eat at these events. Small things like that can also make a massive difference in terms of how well attended game jams can be, but also how inclusive a space can be. So I think that like that's important, right? So here are just a couple of ideas that I've already spoken about quite easily about how to make it a lot better within the industry. I've been talking to Han Lee, who is part of the WITS video game design faculty, and what she's told me is like really exciting. From 5 years ago, they went from only having 2 people of color into the class to now having 78 people in their class, 45% of which are Black Africans, over 50% of which are people of color, 45% which usually in STEM fields is, 45% are women, which usually in STEM fields is significantly lower, like between 15 to 20%. So really seeing huge strides in that way. And I think it's quite exciting, but I think it's also important beyond them just being able to study and get the degree and come in that way, that they also have the ability to make connections with people within the industry, right? I think that's something that's really important, is also, sorry, I'm going to move on to my next slide because I've already said this, but it's going to be about game jams, which is exciting. But one of the most important things I think as well is that they have people that they can look up to within the industry. And like one of the great things about the South African industry is there is a fair amount of women within the industry, which is quite good, I think, because it does give women an aspirational look. I think people like Regina are incredibly important, especially because she's visible, because people need someone they can look up to within the industry who looks like them, right? So that leads me quite nicely onto one of my biggest points in this talk, which is predominantly looking at game jams and how we can change the way we do a game jam sometimes that can be more inclusive, that can change the dynamic for the better and create a more inclusive and a more inclusive and well-rounded space, right? So one of the first things I was thinking about is that we could start having things like pro-amateur game jams. I think that at a point where we can randomize the game jams, so we're making sure that hobbyists or students who can come to the game jams can be paired with someone who's more experienced than them, I think that can be incredibly useful. Not just in terms of like giving them better skills and helping them grow, but I think just in terms of building relationships and connections, because that can be the hardest thing. Once you have a relationship and a connection and an enjoyable time with someone, you're more likely to come back, you're more likely to get invested, and I think that's massively important. One of the other things that I got this idea from the great Mr. Ben Rausch from is perhaps even just having a hobbyist or student game jam on their own, where you have the more experienced developers acting almost as mentors to help them with problems, right? Because one of the big things of pro-ams is it's easy to get paired with someone who knows what they're doing and then just end up helping them with their idea as opposed to feeling comfortable enough to express your own idea, to try and build your own thing. So perhaps also by having more hobbyist and student-focused game jams, what we can also be doing is creating an environment where they can learn and make mistakes and make demos, but have the help necessary without it being overwhelming or overbearing on the younger people. I think that what's also important about game jams, right, is we also need to think about like the time we give a game jam. I think that once you're more experienced with making games, making a game in 8 hours is really easy, or making a demo in 8 hours is fairly easy. Whereas if you extend the time a little bit more, make it 12 hours, make it 24 hours, what you do then, which is really quite nice, is you give newer people the chance to make huge mistakes. I was talking to one of the winners of the essay game jam of the diversity prize. They made a like lovely little game, and they were telling me how within the first 6 hours they had to scrap what they were working with because it didn't work well, and by having more time to work on something, they still made quite a fun, silly, playable game, which I thought was quite cool. So I think that like when we start looking at changing the timing of it, what you do then is you just make it more inclusive and more welcoming for newer people. And particularly when you have a new group coming in, a group that's more diverse, that's a good thing, that we need to be making it easier for people to get involved. One of the bigger things as well, right, is that we need to be thinking about the venues of where we're hosting game jams. So for us, we usually have them at Free Lives, which is quite easy and it's accessible for us to organize. But one of the difficulties for people is that it's also incredibly far, right? It's a difficult place to get to using public transport, And particularly if you have to leave in the evenings, it can be quite tricky for people to get out of there. So another thought is also about making the effort, like as a community, to host game jams in various areas, right? So that they're more central. So the Bandwidth Barn is really nice because it's in Woodstock. Thinking about doing things like that. I would try and say we should also maybe have them earlier so they can end earlier, but I know that none of us will ever wake up early in the morning. Like, I think since I've moved to Cape Town, I've stopped believing that early mornings even exist, which is fine, right? I think we want people at their best and have to accept when people are more likely to make games, which is cool. I think one of the things that has really helped me come to this idea of like why game jams are incredibly important with the community is just seeing how everyone interacts at a game jam. I think the nice thing about it, like particularly when it's a group of people who know each other, is that it's a warm and welcoming space. It's fun, it's not incredibly serious, particularly when there aren't prizes. And I think that it's important to understand that when you create an inclusive space, a big part of that is socializing with people, is me being made to feel welcome within that space, being able to talk to people and ask questions, is being able to just see what people are doing and just getting to know people. And I think like game jams are super important that way. And one of the things that we've chosen to do at Free Lives, for example, is that we don't charge a lot to make sure that people can eat, right? We have like a set amount that's pretty low, and we usually bear the cost of the food, but also we don't like stringently police it. It's like people will give us money, some people don't, but we make sure that everyone can eat. And I think that's important. We make sure their snacks are available, we make sure that there are drinks available. And I think like it is a cost as an indie developer to take on, but it's an important cost because it's important to give back to the community. I think growing the community is hugely important for us because if it doesn't grow, it's not going to survive, right? So that's why I like talking about game jams. One of the last things is thinking about transportation and finding ways so that we can get people who live further away to the game jams and back again. I think that we do have a fair amount of people with cars, or like with things like Uber, is getting into an idea of whether or not we'd be willing to just ferry people to and from game jams. I think that could be massively helpful within the industry in creating a more inclusive space because it makes it easier for people to come to them, right? The other thing I want to speak about, which is a little bit, for me at least, more controversial a little bit, is expos and how we as a community think about them, right? So the first expo I went to when I was part of Free Lives was EGE. And like it was a really great experience. A lot of people came and played our games. We tried to do some panel talks. We tried to have a bit of a workshop, but the organization was terrible. So I don't think it went as well as we could have liked. But I think that when we start thinking about expos, it ought to be less about whether or not we're able to sell our games and more about making people aware. So I think that once we don't have to bear the cost of having a stall at an expo, which can be massively exclusionary for devs ourselves, we should be more getting involved in terms of doing things like panel talks, having workshops, just being around to meet people and greet people and let them know that there are successful South African games that exist in the world, letting them know that there is an industry here that they can get involved in. Because a lot of people are playing these games. A lot of people only know AAA. And I think the more people we get invested in not just playing indie games, but also meeting the people, it's a lot easier to then get people who make up, the middle class and are marginalized involved in gaming. It means it becomes a legitimate career path for them, and I think that's important. There is a lot of risk involved in game making, there's no denying that, but I think that particularly with the indie development scene, it's the best place for marginalized groups to come in because it is a space where people can express themselves, can create interesting and innovative games that express the reality that a lot of people live in this country or on this continent. And I think that that's an important voice to have in gaming. I think that's an important way to get people emotionally invested in gaming and being involved in gaming, even if that's not, the ultimate thing that they make with game making, right? So I have a couple of last thoughts. I think it's important to understand that this is not me sort of trying to sermonize at everyone and say that we're all bad people and we're all exclusionary or racist or sexist or whatever, but rather that we're a microcosm of a larger society. And we end up reproducing a lot of those problems within our microcosm, even when we don't want to, because there's a lot of systemic barriers for people beyond financial, beyond accessing the equipment, which can be extremely expensive, but also just socially and being more aware of how we think about things and how we engage with people and making that active effort to reach out. I also think it's important to understand that we don't want to just do this for the sake of doing the right thing. I mean, it is the right thing and we should do it, but it's also because it is one of the most important ways that we can grow and sustain this industry. I think it's like a vitally important industry in South Africa. I think we're making amazing things and we can continue to do that. And the only way for that to grow substantially and to get the funding that we need sometimes is by actively creating a more inclusive space. I also think that like it's important to understand diversity only genuinely works in terms of creating innovation when you don't just have one person who is part of a marginalized group, whether that's sexually, via their race or gender. You need to create a space where there are more people so you feel open and able to speak out, to talk about issues, to change the way we see things. A great example of it not working is the advertising industry. They still make like terribly cringeworthy adverts because even though there are people of color in those companies, they're often, because they're a small minority, they don't have the power to speak out and to say something or to show if there's a problem within the industry. And so I think that that's how we get diversity, is by pushing for more. And yeah, like I think we can just make things better, guys. Like this game industry is lovely, it's awesome, it's creative, it's filled with amazing people. And it's very important for me that we can share that with more people, with people who could genuinely benefit from this, from people who could, you know, change the way we look at games, who can change the way that we make games, who can make the industry better. And ultimately, that's my talk. I think I even ended a little bit early, so we might be on time. Ha!